time to welcome our next speaker, who's a professor of neurosurgery and psychiatry and I said this is the word you should not miss. I trained and I failed. Let me try again. He's a professor of neurosurgery, psychiatry, and biobehavioral sciences. Sorry, Itzhak. At the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. He's also a professor of neurosurgery at the Tel Aviv University's Faculty of Medicine in Israel. He studies many things, among them recording of single neuron activity coupled with electrical stimulation to understand, modulate, and augment the brain networks underlying human cognition in health and in disease during awake and sleep states. He's going to tell us today about augmenting consciousness. Please help me welcome Itzhak Fried.
Okay. Thank you, Laurent. This was a very generous biobehavioral introduction. In any case, okay, let's proceed. They gave me a very tough topic here. So, augmenting consciousness. You know, I think this is a hard problem. In fact, consciousness is probably maybe the most difficult question in the human condition. A philosopher, Chalmers, had termed it the hard problem. Somehow this stuck, although it's pretty obvious, right? And I think in a paper that I had the privilege to be on it with Francis Crick years ago, I think he used the terminology. He said the neuronal basis of consciousness is the greatest challenge to the scientific worldview. And if you think about it, really, it really places, you know, the mind-body problem, you know, at the center, and finding a physical basis is a challenge. There is no single accepted theory of consciousness. The consciousness scientists are bickering. In fact, there was just in Nature, 2 weeks ago, I think, with the title, Consciousness Theory Slammed a Pseudoscience, okay? Sparkling uproar, okay? In fact, I was stunned to see 131 scientists, actually, some of whom I actually know, signed this. So there is really no single theory of consciousness. We are in the dark. We're asking ourselves, what about animal consciousness? What about machine consciousness? What about this word which was never mentioned here, artificial intelligence consciousness, right? So in the clinical world, we cannot wait until we find out what consciousness is, okay? Because we have to assess consciousness at every point, you know, in time. We have patients who are comatose, so there are certain established, you know, practical, numerical ways of assessing consciousness that are based on the response of the unconscious or semi-conscious patient to various stimuli such as speech or pain. And you know, when I have a patient and the resident calls me in the middle of the night and he says, I have a patient, Glasgow 7. So I know what they're talking about, although we don't really know, right? Because we don't know what consciousness is, okay? But we're also dealing with sort of twilight cases where it's not clear what the difference between a vegetative state, for instance, or a minimally conscious state. And if we understand it does have prognostic implication, patients with MCS, you know, minimally conscious state, have a better prognosis, for instance, in the vegetative state. And in fact, even with an fMRI, there have been studies where you can see that they process information because you see activation on the fMRI. When you're talking about faces or houses, it lights up in different areas. At the same time, you know, we have something going on, right? We have a large part of the population which has a diminishment in the content of consciousness, right? We have Alzheimer's patients, the numbers are staggering. You know, this is going to be in our midst. We need to deal with this issue. And in addition, we have not only a cognitive tsunami of diminished, patients with diminished content of consciousness, but we also have an information tsunami, meaning that these, individuals and we, of course, are barraged by increasing numbers of information that we need somehow to filter. And some of those obviously will remain in our conscious state. So the next thing I just basically want to say is that the language of the brain is electricity. And what you are listening here is simply pulses, which are actually action potentials of the neurons at work that are discharging. And we can translate it to sound, and you will become, in the next 10 minutes, physiologists. You will be able to assess how single neurons respond. The neurons are really the atoms of cognition. So there are billions of neurons, and there are obviously more and more connections. And this is really the substrate, of your mind. So, the next thing that I want to tell you is that electrical stimulation can modify the content of consciousness. And this has already been found in about 100 years ago, when electrical stimulation, or 75 years ago, when electrical stimulation in patients who underwent brain surgery under local anesthesia, because the brain is painless tissue, and you need to keep patient awake sometimes to make sure that you are not interfering with their cognitive function. So when Penfield applied electricity to the brain, it elicited memories, actually, conscious experiences, perceptions and memories, okay? And you can see here, this is, on the lower left of the screen, you can see a 14-year-old that I operated on. She's completely comfortable in talking, during awake surgery. Now here you can see, you can not only introduce memories on percepts, in this patient, not by planning, when we mapped the brain, this patient had electrodes in her brain for epilepsy monitoring. And you will see, in fact, I don't have a laser here, but you can see the finger there, on the right side, and you can see a light. Now, there will be another light which will come on. The patient is reading a paragraph and see what happens. There is no sound, I think, but so she's reading this, okay? Somehow this sound doesn't come through, but the message will. And then you see light comes on. You see the light came on the left. And now she basically starts laughing. So we introduce an emotional state of laughing. And in fact, what happened there, and you can see this is a real laughter. This is not just some artificial thing, okay? So what happened actually is that every time she was looking at something and we pressed the button, she said, "This is funny." This was a paragraph about a rainbow. She says, "Don't you guys see the rainbow is funny? It's ridiculous." And when we were standing around and pressing the button and she laughed, she says, "You guys are so funny." So it's really the brain was able to complement the cognitive content, but the emotion was introduced by electrical stimulation and the motor program as well. So we are dealing basically with atoms of cognition, specialized neurons. We have what's called the human connectome, which is all the connections between all this. And from all this barrage, we are trying to make sense by identifying brain circuits. And that's very fashionable to talk about brain circuits, which are identified with certain cognitive functions in the conscious state. So here, for instance, is a work which won the Nobel Prize of 2014, where this researcher John O'Keefe and the Mosers identify cells which specialized for location and for memory of location. It's a GPS, of your brain. Okay. And we have actually demonstrated in our work later that this GPS also exists in your own brain, although believe it or not, it's probably slowly vanishing because you already delegated this very important function to programs, such as Waze. So what is it all about, really? We have a miraculous organ in the brain. It's a memory hub of the brain, and it looks just like a seahorse, hippocampus. So, and this is right there, put a finger right here, over your ear and go 4 centimeters deep, and there you got it. It's very simple, okay? I don't recommend arriving at it now, but think about it. So in any case, it's very important. Why? Because anything that you will remember tomorrow consciously, and if you remember one word of this lecture, or you remember this tie or whatever, it will be because these were properly processed in the hippocampus. If you don't have it, you will process everything, but I'll go out of the room, come back, you won't even recognize me. So this process of information becoming a content which can be consciously retrieved later is a property of this organ. And actually, when you go to sleep tonight, not during your dreams, but during your deep sleep, your memories will be replayed, and in fact, they'll be transferred from the hippocampus to the rest of the brain. And this is a process called consolidation. So a little bit about our research, we can put electrode in the brain not for science, but for clinical reasons, because we need to monitor epileptic seizures and to understand where they're coming from. So we identified, for instance, cells in the brain, in your own brain, which specializes for concepts, like, a person that you know. For instance, here, all the blue dots indicates, pulses, okay? So this specific neuron just responded to Luke Skywalker, okay? But it didn't matter how he looked. In fact, even if you saw the word Luke Skywalker, even if you heard it, that neuron will respond to this and not to 100 other stimuli. And you have it all in your brain. It's sort of a grandmother type cell, okay? So when you look at this, 200 milliseconds, you already know, bicycle, tongue, you don't care. You know who it is, right? And this is a building block, I think, of conceptual memory, okay? Because we cannot remember every details, okay? And so we have some kind of an abstraction. So in the next thing, you will see what happened in an episode. So we found those neurons that are conceptually, they are active during a full episode. So you will see a lot of episodes, and you will hear the neurons firing. That specific neurons, one neuron among, a billion neurons that we happen to zoom on. Okay, so here it is. Let's see, okay? These things are the firing of the neuron. And it doesn't respond to Martin Luther King, right? It doesn't respond to Madonna, not to Titanic. It doesn't. And then suddenly it sort of starts
Wall Street and the
firing.
New York Stock Exchange, the world's largest, and surprisingly one of.
It actually responds to the Simpsons. Now, we don't have time to show you that it will respond again to it. It's not just a fluke, Somebody started laughing or whatever. In fact, we will leave it so you can see that. Lauren, this is 1 more minute and I'm taking. It's okay? Okay. This is biobehavioral sciences. This is biobehavioral, Lauren, okay? Okay, so Marilyn Monroe, that famous scene is not, the neuron is completely uninterested. And, falling asleep. Okay, Titanic, forget about it. And look, like a clock, like a place cell in the brain. Okay? Now, this in itself, was miraculous because, it was in the ward, it was a lot of noise and all that. Now, the patient, she's trying to remember what she has seen. Now she has memory in action, okay? So she says, yeah, I remember I was at GESDA, okay, or something about New York. She saw a little thing. Or you remember, I had something yesterday, to eat, or whatever. The Hollywood sign. She saw it before. Now the neuron will start firing, okay. The Simpson. So the neuron started firing, and it's called. So she didn't see anything. She was really only in her own mind. Something happened, and the memory came in. That's something which happened before the memory came into the conscious platform. Okay. So that's what we really have, that increase in firing rate. It's not only just one neuron. We happen to sample. There's probably 100,000 neurons which is responsible for that. Now, next, chapter in this story is really something that happened to me many years ago when I was at Yale. I was doing this mapping of stimulation in a very intelligent patient who could really express herself very well. And I stimulated, electrically stimulated the brain, and you can see it on the left side. And suddenly she said to me, I have an urge to move my hand, okay? So it's some kind of will came in by the stimulation. And in fact, it ties in to what was described even before, that before voluntary action, there is actually an increase in potential that even can be identified at the scalp. And we later identified it as neurons in the frontal lobe, not where the hippocampus is, which is in the temporal lobe, but in the frontal lobe. But also there, something interesting happened. Before the patient or the subject had the will to move, actually, there was already an increase, okay? And that raised a disturbing philosophical question, right? What is free will and what is free recall? I mean, we're able to accept the fact that we may not have free recall, we're getting old, but free will, I mean, anybody's going to take it from us. But we have a neuronal signature, which is prior to that, okay? So that experiment was done on pressing a button, but it can be done on pressing a gun or doing any action, okay? So if you have here an experiment which we did, the patient was driving, a virtual car. At some point they decided to move left or right in the next, intersection, and we could read their mind, meaning we could tell that they are going to go to the right or they're going to go to the left. That's terrible, right? Somebody's going to read your mind, but there is something even more interesting. We can read the mind before the mind is made, okay? Which brings us to what can be done, at least, practically it's a different question, but at least in theory, and from what we find out, you can read conscious minds. You can predict minds before they are made, okay? And then you can edit minds. That would be the next step. Maybe you want to take a deep breath. All right. So, anyway, so what's happening? There is there was a wonderful lecture this morning in the neuro, augmentation section by Dr. Henderson, who talked about, brain-machine interfaces, and the idea of a brain-machine interface is you connect the brain directly with the environment and you bypass, our slow, impaired, or injured body, okay? Whether it's an injury in the spinal cord or whatever. So already 10 years ago, the technology was there to be able to actually move a prosthetic arm, as you can see here on the left, moving a robotic arm just by intention, by thinking, okay? Because the signals are transmitted to the arms. The patient sees the arms, it goes back to the brain communicates with the arm communicates with the brain because you can see it, it's a closed loop. And now, in just this year, in work done at Stanford by Dr. Henderson, also worked at UCSF, you can basically restore speech, meaning that you can go directly from the brain and bypass, motor problems en route, okay? The speech itself, the centers are okay, but it cannot really communicate with the environment, okay? So that's what is done. Now, here, we essentially moved from 2012, where things were pretty slow still in speech, we moved to the speed of speech. This can be done at the speed of speech, meaning, 100 words per minute, okay? We're only the speed of speech. Stay tuned. Okay, now deep brain stimulation is an established clinical entity, okay? Meaning that even with 4 contacts that you can see here on an electrode, primitive technology of 25, 30 years ago, we can already make tremendous changes in the life of Parkinson patient, and probably soon, and also dystonia, which is a terrible movement disorder. Even if we don't fully understand it, we can do it, and it is in clinical use with 4 contacts. That's all, okay? So, we were actually moving or trying to move from motor to cognitive and saying, well, can we actually deal not just with motor center, but with the memory center? And in 2012, we already showed that when you look at information, if we stimulate that area of the seahorse, remember, then we can actually improve your memory for space, finding your way home or finding your car in the parking lot, okay? So, obviously there was a lot of interest, right? DARPA got very interested. So it's not only the clinical world which is interested in that, but the industry, the defense industry. There are a lot of potential implications, right? And now we've just shown recently in 2023, we showed that basically what we do is at night. Again, these are patients who have electrodes for other reasons, for epilepsy, but we showed that by stimulating during that period of consolidation, when you are deep asleep, we have a closed loop. We sense, record in the hippocampus, the seahorse, we stimulate in the frontal lobe, and we actually help this interaction. And actually, when the patient wakes up, they remember better, because of this stimulation while they're asleep. They don't need to do anything, they don't feel anything, their memory is improved. So in principle, there is some, potential here in something that I would say, well, we all accept hearing aids, what's wrong with a memory aid if it can be done? But can it be done? That's the question. Can it be done on a practical level? Can it be done invasively, non-invasively? So, what I want to say about the issue of editing memories is that we have 4 levels. One is decoding, meaning we translate neural activity into a particular memory, to a particular movement. We are very good in the computational aspect already. Enhancing, we can really enhance the system, certainly in motor, but we can start maybe to enhance it in memory. Now, what about inception and deletion? Inception meaning introducing a foreign memory, okay? Or deleting a specific memory. Now, you may look at it as some kind of despotic future, but in fact, you can delete a post-traumatic memory. So it can have clinical uses. So we have all the ingredients here, right? We have, Marion Cotillard here, which you probably have neurons for her if you have seen it. You can identify this. We can enhance her during sleep. You will remember her better. Already experiments in rodents being able to introduce artificial memories for place or deletion of specific memories for place. So the stumbling block really here is really technology. And that means that basically, if we have clinical use with 4 contacts, what about having 1,000 contacts? And that's what, for instance, people like Elon Musk are really trying to do, in his company, which is Neuralink, and he wants to connect, thought to external devices. And we are talking here about the speed of thought now, which is even faster than the rate of speech, right? So basically, if we're trying to summarize what we are against and what we are for, really, that we can maybe edit the content of human consciousness. Now, if we look at a far future of integration or hybridization of brain and machine, we're talking about externalization of brain function, about embodiment of prosthetic device, and about maybe something like hybrid consciousness. 5 years later, increased delegation of brain function to external devices, and increasing internalization of appendices, right? We're already doing it. Now we forgot how to write. In Sweden, they now teach students how to actually write because they forgot how to write. They only can press keys. We're losing this, okay? We're losing our navigation. Forget about it, All what we know is turn right, turn left, second exit in the roundabout. That's all what I know, right? Clinical trials in memory augmentation will become in 5 years. There will be embodied motor. All these things which I showed you about speech, which Jamie Henderson is doing, will probably enter clinical use, okay? Because they will be smaller and Neuralink already got an FDA approval to go ahead. 10-year augmenting memory during wake-sleep cycles, enter clinical practice, memory aid for early dementias, editing minds in clinical trials, use of non-invasive neuroprosthetic in general population. So people will look for non-invasive ways of really doing it. Cognitive BCI develops. And in the far future, memory aid for wide use in non-clinical populations, editing minds enter clinical practice, PTSD, dementias, OCD, embodied cognitive neuroprosthetics. That is hybrids, the hybrids. I mean, look at this. What are we trying to do? First, we're trying to get to the speed of motor. Second, to the speed of speech. Third, to the speed of thought. But that's not even enough. Our thought works in milliseconds. 200, rate of speech, 600 milliseconds per word, okay? Rate of thought, 300, 400 milliseconds, okay? That's not good enough. Algorithms operate in nanoseconds, okay? So you see where that rationale can lead us to. So wherever we are speechless, we turn back to Freud, right? And we say, man, and he said it in the, we're talking about today contents. GESDA is talking about contents of civilization, but GESDA is also talking about discontents of civilization, right? So man has, as it were, become a kind of prosthetic god. When he puts on all his auxiliary organs, he's truly magnificent. But those organs have not grown on him, and they still give him much troubles at time. Thank you. Do you have time for questions? By your behavior.
Yeah, gosh, so much to unpack here. So you're promising us a more intelligent, more conscious world, which is the opposite of what we see every day on social media. It's a nice promise. I come out optimistic out of your talk. I mean, there's so much to ask. So please send your questions. I'm sure they're going to come. They're already coming, actually. Let's jump to that. Under the assumption that there is no consensus yet, what is your definition of consciousness? You thought you would escape that with that first slide, but we're coming back on this. Give us your definition of consciousness, please.
Well, I cannot, really. I mean, basically, the arguments now go, I mean, there was actually a paper just, probably two months ago, where people were looking at consciousness as perhaps, a set of algorithm in principle, and that sort of functional, computation. And in principle, they said, if there will be a set, of algorithms that is sufficient and necessary, it is in principle possible. But another, approach is that there's really something missing, meaning that consciousness is part of being. And the question of what does it mean to be really, right? You need to have something in a body, right? So things like integrated information theory sort of emphasize that issue of being rather than doing, okay? And that's a really, topic for a much more elaborate discussion. But
there's another word I'd like to run by you. We hear a lot about AI, artificial intelligence. Do you think it's fair to use the word intelligence in that context? Is what machines give us?
I think you have to separate intelligence, from consciousness. In fact, a lot of the computation that you are doing, a lot of cognitive function is happening at an unconscious level, really. Really, because otherwise, if you need to be conscious to do everything, you wouldn't function and you will not survive, okay? So there is really a major, difference, I think, between intelligence. I think artificial intelligence is a correct name versus natural intelligence, meaning artificial intelligence does have, obviously, some advantages, over this. I mean, we talk about, what are the elements of rules and values in AI, but this is a different topic of discussion. But consciousness is just, a certain aspect of intelligence, really, that we are using. It's a platform, that we need. So in that sense, I think AI is a reasonable term, really.
What do you think about the psychedelic medicine, meditation, and augmented consciousness?
Well, we didn't really get into the states of consciousness, and I mean, the whole issue, for instance, of psychedelics, which is probably a session on, which is now actually entering medical practice to some extent. There's no question that you have altered state of consciousness, okay? So you may have, I don't know if you can call it augmented consciousness, but definitely it's a different type of consciousness, or there is something different. And meditation is probably a way, to organize your consciousness. So in that case, you can call it a different state of consciousness, but I think you are still within the general rubric of consciousness.
But this morning we had a session, and we're told that there are ways to treat certain conditions, for example, PTSD, with psychedelic substances. Like,
yes.
You think it's also? I think the question was, are these things promising avenues of dealing with some of the mental health conditions that you are tackling through a different angle?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we have enough data, but I know that it is sort of in Australia, for instance, there is, now changes that enable the use of psychedelics for depression, or other disorders. But I think, again, it's probably directed to certain circuits in the brain. We have a certain understanding now about, what is the depression circuit, so to speak. And I think that those, elements, in the same way that amphetamine, works on your dopaminergic system and enhances certain things like concentration, etc. In the same way, those type of chemical agents can really modify, neuropsychiatric conditions. Yeah.
Question number 3: will we have brain editing in the next 5 years? Somebody came to me and whispered, CRISPR for consciousness, the gene editing technique called CRISPR. Do you think we're going to have brain editing in the next 5 years if embedded devices become a reality?
Yeah, I mean, this is really what I was talking about. You can edit memory, but you can edit, will. You may be able to edit emotions. I mean, I think in principle, the idea is that you have, a certain behavioral construct, a certain cognitive construct, and you have a neural signature, and then that you can intervene. So really, that's what the whole thing which I was dealing with, but that's probably the farthest level, because editing requires specificity. It's not just, enhancing your hearing, for instance, but you may want to enhance, you may want to enhance, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. I mean, that's going a little bit too far. But you will be able to specifically intervene, and that is really the challenge in editing. It's not necessarily only a despotic scenario, because you do have situations where people have, awful trauma. We just have, in Israel, we now have, thousands, hundreds of people with very specific, awful trauma, right? And some of them many of them probably will develop a chronic condition as a result of that. Yeah.
Many questions coming in. Number 4, what is your view on brain organoids?
On what, brain?
Organoids, like kind of synthetic organs recreated. If I'm not wrong, if the person who asked the question wants to correct me, I'll take it. Could they have clinical application in neurodegenerative diseases?
You know, I really don't know. I mean, I don't know enough about organoids. It's really a field in very, in infancy at this point. And
It's the topic of our next
there are so
session.
many, issues about interfacing it, with human live brain. I think that is beyond the GESDA radar. And I was told to limit myself to 25 years.
Next question, as we think about augmenting consciousness, do you foresee the possibility of developing shared or hive consciousness?
Well, I mean, hybrid, there's a lot of stuff going on now in social, neuroscience. In a sense, you are developing a hybrid connection to your neighbors around you because you have even a system like mirror neurons, which mean neurons which are mirroring neurons of the other person. So there are mechanisms, there are neuronal mechanisms, which are active in the social brain. So in the same way, that you have sort of hybrid consciousness with external devices, you cannot rule out the possibility of having, connection, because in the same way that you can communicate with a device, you can communicate with a person. Right? If you think about device A and device B. Although I hate to think about ourselves as devices, it's a little upsetting.
It's interesting to think of a football team like PSG, maybe there's potential for them to finally play as a team. Anyway, it's a European joke, sorry about that.
Okay.
What's a very bad American football team? Whatever, stop losing friends right now. Your experiments seem to be based on those who have disorders. How generalizable are your findings to the wider population?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general this is a good point that most of the research that we can do at this level can only be done in clinical populations. Okay, and the argument is it really applicable? But in general, we find out that it is applicable because it's also supported by other methodologies, which is like functional MRI that can be done, in the general population. And even, Penfield's finding about the homunculus, that arrangement in the brain of the body mapped onto the brain, which was found in this patient, proved itself to be really correct. So I think we have to be cautious, but I think it is, generalizable as long as we stay within the framework of neuroscience and interact with other methods.
Next question on Neuralink. You mentioned it, one of the many Elon Musk startups. They just got FDA approval for a device. How this raises ethical questions. How are these ethical questions on editing memory approached in your own lab?
No, we don't really have access to this type of technology, and I think it will have to progress really in the same way that I've shown it. I think devices like Neuralink, coupled with the research, which I mentioned about speech, brain-machine interface, and motor. At this point, they are really asking for approval for it in patients who are paralyzed. Okay, so I think that's something that the public, will accept, right? If you have a paralyzed patient, and you have a way, to do it safely, and you can restore movement, then, very few people can argue about it. The next level is, of course, speech, which is a bit more complicated than that. So it will always go through a medical door. The question is, how far you can expand it. That's the question. I'm certainly not at this stage because I don't have access to this type of technology, and I'm limited by the clinical situation that I'm working in.
Questions keep on coming, so I'll try to go through as many with the little time we have. Singularity coming up next. Could we transfer our brains to electronic means? If we can enhance memory, could we also store our memories in the cloud somewhere?
Yeah, well, this is obviously the popular culture, the idea that you will download your brain. Yeah, that's. But again, you may be able to, download, algorithms. I don't think you will be able to download being, right? And that's really, I think, the main issue in consciousness. That's why it's so difficult.
And maybe all you need is a little USB stick. Like, we don't need the cloud for your brain, sir. It's okay. Can we talked about download, let's talk about upload. Can we start uploading skills to our brain? Like you mentioned popular culture, like in the Matrix or everything.
Well, I mean, in a sense, you certainly, can upload, things that, meaning already, we have the technology in epilepsy patients. There's already a clinically approved device, which keeps recording your brain waves, okay? And basically, when there is a sign of a seizure, epileptic seizure coming on, that the device will instill electrical stimulation to stop it or to avert it, okay? So, and in fact, the patient actually, uploads, the seizure activity, and it goes to Mountain View. That's happening now. It's not like, science fiction. So if you follow that, so here is a neural activity which is very clear, relatively understood. But if there is a neural signature for every behavior, then in principle, you can transmit it and upload it and store it.
Interesting. There's a question 10 is more a comment, I think. It's like science is part of consciousness. You can't have science without consciousness. Perhaps that's why science cannot explain consciousness properly.
Well, I mean, this is why this is a very fair sentence, right? It's the biggest challenge to the world scientific view. But it doesn't mean that science is done only consciously. The benzene ring has been seen in a dream, right? Also, dream is a conscious state. I must take it back. But it has been seen in a dream. So, and then, woke up and said, this is a benzene ring, okay? So, there are a lot of unconscious processes, I think, which are involved in science, because this really is a processing of information, even during deep sleep, which is definitely unconscious, that is still going on, okay?
Yeah. Quickly, I'll try to sneak in 2 more questions. Very simple one. Is the signature for turning left or right the same for every human being?
No, every human being is different.
Interesting. So you get a difference.
Is an individual.
That would explain a lot of
generalities. The generalities, meaning, the generalities. We know that information is stored in certain areas, but I think there's so much individual variation, and these are such dynamic systems that change all the time. You associate information, you manipulate information. So no, they're not identical, but they may have similar patterns. Yeah.
So there's more questions about brain activity. There's questions about hacking the brain. I'm going to finish on this one, which I
hacking
found
the brain is an
fascinating.
interesting one because
it is.
Hacking is usually understood, as stealing information from your brain, right? And in principle, yes, we can read minds. We talked about that, but it's also hacking in the other way around, meaning you can insert, false information. What is done, of course, just
Yeah, we saw it.
Go in social media.
Right?
You go in social media and you get all this brain hacking going on already.
But the person laughing was brain hacking. The person that was laughing. The patient you showed us the video. It's a form of hacking, like.
Well, it's a form of. The only problem is that it wasn't intended.
I know that's what I'm saying.
But in principle, you can. So you have seen that if you really have the signature and you have the right spot and you have the right circuit, you can introduce laughing and you can actually affect, your cognitive interface with your surrounding. I mean, that young woman, she basically, we kind of incidentally introduce the laughter, the emotion. We introduce even the motor program, but the brain, interpreted it.
That's
and
what
that actually what happens.
Right?
A lot of places, and a very effective way of affecting brains on the internet, and one topic is really fear, and fear is a very effective, stimulus. That then you can interpret it in various ways, okay?
But I'm thinking, you know, with that technology, you could have a 3 hours Fidel Castro speech, and the audience would laugh all the time. You know, that's hacking. That's not supposed to happen.
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
you will put Fidel Castro, and you will put this in, and they will have say Fidel
3
Castro
hours
is funny.
every speech.
It's
That
funny,
was
yeah,
the short talks
Yeah,
for
yeah.
3 hours. Okay, we'll finish on this one. It's a great question. Thank you for sending it. There's more you'll have to. I'm sure the audience is going to want to talk to you after. Do people that get implants differentiate between me and the implant?
Say it again. This was a.
Do people that get implants,
Yeah.
do they differentiate between me and the implant? Like the implant says this or I say this. So you become one with the machine.
No, this is the whole issue of embodiment, and I think there is really a process where of embodiment, but certainly in situation where something is implanted in Parkinson patients, they don't feel like the device is necessarily. They feel the feeling of agency remains, really, the feeling of agency, because you're really talking about the feeling of agency.
Exactly.
I mean, I think in principle it can be affected, but in many ways there's a feeling of agency.
So it's like, that's the difference between us and you, is that I asked this question like, of course not, like we have no way of knowing what happens when you have a brain implant. So thank you for explaining that to us, because we need to ask you about these questions. Like there are so many things that are raised by these technologies, like if I get one, is it me, or the implant, is that differentiated? We had no idea before seeing you. So thank you for educating us. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. Thank you for letting us know about what's ahead. That was Itzhak Fried, ladies and gentlemen.
It's been a pleasure.